This is Clive to Carle. Welcome to another edition of the Health Revolution. And today it's a totally different show. We're going to be looking at the health of a nation and the people living in it, and the nation being South Africa. And I'm with Karin Smith, who has really some incredible history to share with us. Because I thought I had some vague idea of history of South Africa, but it turned out that absolutely pretty much everything I knew was totally upside down and wrong. So welcome, Karin.
Hi, Clive, and thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, thank you. So, um, uh, who arrived in South Africa first from a white person's perspective? Who discovered it? Who colonized it? And what did they find when they arrived?
Clive, this is one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about South Africa. When they think of South Africa, they think of it being inhabited by the noble savage, these big, dark, strong men with their assegais and their shields. Well, yes, 120 years after the whites arrived, that might have become the truth. But when the whites arrived in 1652, at the same time that they were founding New Amsterdam, which became New York in America, Jan van Riebeck was an employee of the Dutch East India Company. Now, they were sending ships around this Cape of Good Hope, also known as the Cape of Storms, to go to the East and trade there. And they wanted to establish a refreshment station for their ships at the Cape. They did not intend to colonize the country at all. They just wanted to establish some farms there to grow vegetables and farm meat for the ships to replenish when they were going on this long, long journey. Because as you know, at the time, people got scurvy, sailors got very ill, they didn't have enough fresh food, they ate pickled pork that was probably turning green. And it wasn't a healthy situation at all. So the Dutch East India Company sent Jan van Riebeck to start a refreshment station at the Cape. When they arrived there, they found one very small tribe of black people, and they're not even really black. The Khoi, or the Hottentots, as the British and some other people referred to them, are very small, little, almost yellow-skinned people that the world understands as Bushmen. The world mostly knows about the Bushmen. They're tiny little people, yellow skinned. They speak a language unlike any other in the world. It's a whole bunch of clicking noises that white people cannot really get their tongues around. And they were nomadic. They had little hide tents that they could fold up and carry on their backs, and they wandered from place to place with their animals. But there were not many of them at all, and even they were not indigenous to South Africa. They came from the north and had little nomadic groups of them wandering around the coastline of South Africa. So Jan van Riebeck established this trading post, and they traded with the Khoi for their animals, and the Dutch brought in indentured servants from Holland, and they established the farms and started growing fruits and vegetables there, and traded with the Khoi for the meat. But the Khoi, of course, never having come in contact with civilization before, they saw the Dutch farms and the Dutch produce as free for the taking. So they clashed with the Dutch, and there were problems, but in general, not really big problems because there weren't many whites and there weren't many Khoi, and they kind of lived in a armed truce state, trading with each other. Well, when the indentured servants had served their indenturedness, they were then given pieces of land by the Dutch to start their own farms. But they could not trade with anybody else or at any other price than those set by the Dutch East India Company. And they still fell under the company rules and the company laws. And That is how Cape Town got started, how the South African white population began. Well, as more and more indentured servants got their own farms, and as they disliked the control of the Dutch East India Company over them more, they started chafing at the bit a little bit. And the Cape Colony changed hands. The British got it from the Dutch. There are some stories that it was bought from the Dutch for £60,000, but I cannot guarantee that that is a true story. Then, under some treaty, they gave it back to the Dutch, and the Dutch controlled it again. And then the French Huguenots started flocking in because they, after the Edict of Nantes was revoked, they were being terribly treated and tortured for their religion in their countries. So a lot of French, more upper class people came to South Africa. Now, that was when actual civilization, the top class, the aristocracy, the well-dressed people, the slave owners arrived in South Africa with the French Huguenots. But they were the people who brought wine and vine cuttings and things to the Cape, and found that certain areas of the Cape were very, very productive for this. So they brought a different class of people, and they also brought the vines, for which South Africa is to this day very, very well known. They grow the most incredible, incredible wine. And in between all of this, the Dutch settlers, the original Dutch settlers, had already established a language of their own, which is a kind of it's derived from Dutch and German. It became known as Afrikaans, but it was originally developed as a way to be able to speak to the Khoi and the black servants. So they had their own language. They were very Calvinistic religious people. They had their own brand of religion. And they started chafing at the bit because they thought that the Cape was becoming too liberal and ungodly, and they didn't like it. They also didn't like the rule that they had to sell their produce only to one person at prices set by them. So some of them formed bands of people and decided to leave and go and find a place of their own where they could rule themselves with their own rules. They could have their religion and they could have freedom. And very much like they did here in the USA, they had wagons, covered wagons, which were pulled by oxen. And they started forming parties to trek out of the Cape. This was 100 years after the first settlement, and there were still no noble black savages to be seen anywhere. So they left.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
At some point, there must have been pioneers who had no clue where they were going to end up.
Oh, they had no idea whatsoever. They just knew that they didn't like where they were, and they were going to go and find a place where they would be happy that could belong to them, and they were going to go and take this piece of land and make it an Afrikaner republic. But they had no idea what was waiting for them in the hinterlands in the veldt of South Africa. They had no idea whatsoever because nobody had been there. They were previous to the Dutch. There were some Portuguese explorers who had landed in the Cape, gone a little bit inland, and got disillusioned and said, no, this is terrible, barren, dry country. We don't need it, and left. So the interior of South Africa was not planned, mapped, explored, none of those things. These people were heading off totally into the unknown with all their worldly goods in a little covered wagon, and praying to their God, which they firmly had faith in and still do to this day, that he would take them to the right place. So small groups of them would go off together with all their worldly goods and enough provisions that they could fit into it and headed off into the unknown. Now, this was not an easy thing at all because part of the Cape is the Karoo, which is a semi-desert, terribly arid, dry, hot, awful area. I mean, I drove through the Karoo at midday, and it's like driving through an oven. It is hot and dry and just totally barren and flat. And off they went now looking for a place that they could call their own. And at the Fish River, they met the first blacks. These were people who were later to become known as Zulus, but at that stage they didn't have a national identity because they had come from further up north and were going south to find a place of their own as well. Now, that was the biggest genocide of black people ever known in Africa, was when these tribes came south from far north, as far as Nigeria and further up. They came down, and it was called the Mafekani or the Defekani. It was a total genocide of any tribe that stood in their way. They came down, slaughtered the men, stole the cattle, enslaved the children, and took the women. Now, they killed, there is no number known to us because they didn't count, they didn't have numbers, they didn't keep records, they didn't have writing, they hadn't invented the wheel yet. So these were total uncivilized groups of people who just killed and slaughtered their way through Africa. Now, this group of people then met up with the Boers trekking north, and they were coming south. They met up at the Fish River. Now, as I said before, the Boers, the Dutch, had been in South Africa at that stage for 120 years without meeting any black people other than the Khoi. At the Fish River, which is kind of a natural barrier in South Africa, they met the first blacks that they had ever met. Now, the blacks were astonished at these white people, who they call, to this day, they call us Malungu, or foam of the sea, because of the color of us. And they were a bit astounded at the firearms and the wagons and the wheels and all these things that they had never seen before. And they were horrible, horrible clashes, because these blacks were used to just annihilating everything that stood in their way. So obviously they attacked the Voortrekkers fought back. And there were many skirmishes between the two groups, which led to the Battle of Blood River and other well-known historical clashes between them. Now, the Battle of Blood River was the most incredible battle. It has gone down in history as never to be seen on this earth before or again, where so few people beat so many that came against them. The Boers decided that they were tired of these little clashes with the blacks, and they were going to force a battle on their terms, on their ground. So they chose a piece of land on the banks of which is now known as the Blood River, and they formed their little circle. There were 470 to 500 Boers. They left their women and children somewhere else in a safe area, and they lagered their wagons, which means drew them up into a circle, and put thorn bushes between the wheels so that it wasn't so easily accessible. And they were a very small contingent of them. And what they did was they prayed for 5 days and 5 nights to their God. And they said, God, if you give us the victory in this battle which is to come, we will declare the day of our victory a Sunday, a day of worship forever and ever, for time immemorial. That will be a day of thanks to you. After 5 days and 5 nights of prayer, the Zulus finally attacked. Now, the Zulus attacking is an amazing thing in those days. If anybody has seen Shaka Zulu, they will understand what I'm talking about. The Zulus were hidden in the long grass because this was just total veldt. I mean, there wasn't civilization. And they would hide in the long grass and hiss. And there was this incredible hissing sound. It sounded as if the wind were approaching this circle of wagons. And there were, once again, figures are very hard to come by, but it is between 15,000 and 20,000 are the lower end estimates of the number of Zulus that attacked this little lager of wagons. They stood up out of the bush with this hissing noise, and they beat their assegais on their hide shields and screamed, Bulala, Bulala, which means kill, kill. And they came in enormous waves, attacking this little compound with 500 men and boys in it. At the end of the day, there were 3,000 counted Zulu dead, and not one white death amongst those men. There were 3 people lightly wounded, but not one dead. And the Zulus withdrew and did not come back. And to this day, the Day of the Covenant or the Day of the Vow is celebrated in South Africa by the whites, not anymore. It used to be a public holiday where people went to church or went to the Voortrekker Monument in Pretoria and gave thanks to God for that victory. But nowadays, it's not such a acceptable day because the whites don't rule the country and they have very little say in what happens there. Anyway, after that enormous battle, the Zulus eventually congregated, had a king, had a compound where they lived, and one of the Boers, after much trekking here, there, and everywhere, they decided that they were going to go to see the Zulu king and ask him for a piece of land. Now, note, he did not own the land, but they wanted a peaceful resolution where they'd call a truce and could get a piece of land that belonged to them. They would then not fight the Zulus, and the Zulus would not fight them. So they went to see the king. And a delegation of about 70 Boers went to see the king. And they went to his compound and they had this indaba, which is a discussion. And it was agreed that a certain area of land would belong to the whites. And the king put his thumbprint on a piece of parchment where the agreement was signed. And shortly after that, when the celebrations began, he stood up and shouted, Bulala Tugati, which means kill the wizards. Now, they thought the whites were wizards because, as I've already said, they had things and firearms and things that were unknown to the blacks at that time. So his impies then stood up, surrounded this party of people under a white flag of truce, and killed the lot of them. Well, they had left their women and children some miles away in a wagon train in order to come and sign this agreement with the king. And the Zulus then went out and slaughtered the women and children. And that began an enormous conflict between the trekkers and the Zulus because they didn't have towns or anything, the whites, at that time. So they were only isolated bands of these fur trekkers looking for a place to stay. There was some conflict with the British at the same time because the British had colonized Natal, which is a province of South Africa on the east coast. It is the most fertile, beautiful, has the highest rainfall. It is just a lush, tropical, beautiful area of the country. And the British had annexed it and called it Natal, and they were in charge there. Now, some of the Boers tried to move into Natal and find towns for themselves there. It didn't go too well for the same reason that they had left the Cape in the first place. They found the British too liberal, too pro-black, um, and they didn't. Any problems that arose, the British magistrates, etc., would always find on the side of the blacks rather than on the side of the fur trekkers. So they up and left there as well after a while and trekked further across the Vaal River. Eventually, they established two Boer republics. One called the Republic of the Transvaal, which means crossing the Vaal, and the other was the Boer Republic of the Vrystaat, which is now today, well, it was called the Orange Free State. It's no longer called that. So they had these two little republics where they were ruled by themselves. They were mostly rural people. The towns were like trading posts, but they were essentially farming people. Now, the farms were continually under attack by the Zulus and other marauding blacks, and the fur trekkers had learned to defend themselves and to take care of themselves. But the governments of these two republics were not they were not voted in. There was no democratic process. They were just leaders chosen by the people. For instance, Paul Kruger, a great man, they called him Paul, which means Uncle Paul, uncle being a term of respect for anyone older than yourself or in a position of authority over yourself. The Afrikaners still call people today Oom and Tannie, which means uncle and aunt, as a term of respect. They were kind of chosen by the people, and the rule was not strict. There weren't enormous government rules and taxes and all these kind of things, because the Afrikaner did not believe in that. They had trekked away from it. They didn't want it. They just wanted to be farmers and to be left alone. Well, that was all well and good until diamonds and gold were discovered. Now, diamonds were discovered in the Free State and gold was discovered in the Transvaal. Until this time, there had been an uneasy peace between the British colonizers and these two Afrikaans republics. But they had kind of left them on their own because they were poor and they were no threat to the British rule whatsoever. But now, the Brits were almost bankrupt due to the wars that they had been fighting, and they wanted the gold and the diamonds. They needed it because their economy was in tatters from the wars and the colonies that they had all over the world. So the Afrikaners eventually said, okay, well, you can have these. You can have the gold and the diamonds. We don't really need them, but just go away and leave us alone. Well, of course, that wasn't going to happen. And that led to two Boer wars. Now, the first Boer War was a very short duration, and the Boers won that war. But the second Boer War is the one that is of great importance to everybody and to history. The second Boer War, the Brits had learned some lessons during the First Boer War. They discovered that the Afrikaners did not have a way of fighting that they understood, because the British marched off to war in their red jackets and their white pants with a little drummer boy in front of them, miles and miles and miles of supply trains, etc. You could see them coming miles away because of the clouds of dust that were thrown up by them and the noise that they made. Now, the Boers, on the other hand, did not have an organized army as such because they didn't have governments. So a Boer farmer would join up to and go to war, and he had to bring with him his horse, his rifle, and supplies for 7 days in his saddlebags. But he could go home and harvest his lands, and he could go home and visit his wife. They were not paid a shilling a month or whatever the Brits were being paid. They were a very informal army who were protecting their homes, their families, and their lifestyle from invasion. And they would then attack the wagons, supply trains, or a certain part of the British Army. They would come out on their horses, their little poor ponies, from behind a hill or rise up out of the grass, attack a portion of the train, and then get on their horses and flee. They didn't line up in battle lines with the British opposite them and fire shots at each other and the conventional warfare as it was known in those days. These people developed a guerrilla warfare, which was very, very successful against the British, and the British weren't quite sure how to fight against this. Now, in the First World War, they did not bring in extra people from Britain, but in the Second World War, they shipped them in by their thousands because they were determined to win this war and get the golden diamonds and the riches of these Boer republics. So the British eventually realized that the reason that the South Africans didn't have supply trains was because every single farm was a supply depot for them. The Boers had left their women and children on the farms, but they could go to any farm at any time, get a fresh horse, food, sleep the night, whatever was required, and then go out and join their commando group again. And when the British realized this, they instituted a scorched earth policy in South Africa. So they would burn the farms, salt the land, poison the wells, and ship the women and children off to concentration camps. Now, I do believe that there had been one other instance of British concentration camps at this time, but I think that the South African ones were the first really instituted awful concentration camps the world had known. So they put these women and children and the elderly, they put them in tents in awful conditions. They didn't have sanitation. They didn't have water. They scarcely had food. They were just put there and left to their own devices. Now, in that time, at least 25% of the Boer population died of cholera, typhoid, starvation, malnutrition, smallpox, the most awful, awful way of dying. They died in those camps. Now, there were not many Afrikaners to start with, and so to lose, I think it was 20,000 or more of them died in those camps. So the Boers now had nowhere they could go and resupply themselves, and they had no reason to continue fighting because they were fighting for their children, their wives, their homes. They had nothing to continue fighting for, so they gave up. The British did not win the Boer War in battle. They won it by killing the women and children and burning the farms, salting the land, and poisoning the water. So now the Boers not only had lost their wives, their children, they had lost their farms. There was nowhere to go back to. There was nothing for them after that war, nothing. They had to start from the very beginning again. Now imagine a populace that has lost such a huge percentage of their population, women and children mainly. So these men had there were no children, and there were very few women. So to start again and build up a country again was an incredible feat on the part of these disillusioned, lonely, sad men. But they did. They rose from the ashes like a phoenix, and they rebuilt. They were under British rule at this time, and the remaining Boers did not like the British at all, fairly enough because of what they had done. But they did rebuild. And in In 1948, the British handed South Africa, well, for the first time ever, the Afrikaners won an election. The National Party came into power, and although they were still under British rule, they had their own parliament and their own language and their own everything. Now, another fallacy about South Africa is that the National Party invented apartheid, which is why white South Africans are so vilified worldwide to this day, is because of this concept of apartheid. Apartheid literally means separateness, and it is the same thing as segregation in the United States. It just meant to be separate, to have your own government, your own rules, to be ruled by your own people, and to live separately. The Zulus were eventually given Zululand, the Vendors were given Venda, the Swanas were given Botswana, etc., etc. They had their own homelands, and the whites had their homeland. And that is how apartheid was in South Africa. But it was started by the British, not by the Afrikaner government who came into power in 1948. In 1948, they inherited the no mixed marriage laws, the Land Act of 1913, signed by the British, which did not allow land to be owned by blacks. They inherited that whole system of segregation. And yes, the Dutch government, the Afrikaans government strengthened those laws and made them more widespread. But one needs to understand that this was acceptable around the world at that time. Most countries had one or other form of segregation. They had slaves, which were not big in South Africa. And another thing is that no slave ever came out of South Africa. They were not rounded up in South Africa and sold into slavery. That happened up north. It did never, ever, ever. No one slave ever came out of South Africa. So that these blacks worldwide now asking, there's a petition up in the United States asking to be allowed to go back to their roots, is absolute nonsense, because no slave ever came out of South Africa. Anyway, the Afrikaner government, the National Party, came into power in 1948, and they strengthened the apartheid laws and gave it a name. Until then, it was just separate development, segregation, black versus white. It didn't have a name. So they called it apartheid, separateness. And during the apartheid years, which lasted from 1948 to about 1992, they gave to the blacks, each tribe. Now, there are 11 official languages in South Africa today. So there are 11 or more tribes of blacks in South Africa. They gave each of them their own homeland, and at the taxpayer, the white taxpayer's expense, they built roads, waterworks, electricity, airports, schools, universities, everything that a modern country would need, the white taxpayer paid for in each of these black homelands, and they supported them. But they were never, even at the height of white rule, there were never more than 6 million whites in South Africa. So there were not enough of them to do all the jobs required to build a country, for instance, mining. So they allowed the blacks to come into the white areas and work there, but they had to carry a passport, which it was called a pass, and this was one of the big friction points between the blacks and the whites was that the blacks had to carry a pass, and they had to have it on them at all times in order to prove that they were in the white homeland legally, and that they had a reason to be there. So they could come in and work, but they were not residents or citizens of the white area. They lived and belonged in their own areas, but they could come and work. There were hostels built for them because it was mainly men who left their families in the homeland and came into the white areas to work. Now, one of the things that is said is that the whites oppressed the blacks and murdered them by their thousands, hundreds of thousands, if you believe some of the stories. But the black population during the Afrikaner rule of South Africa grew by 920%. It grew by that. Their life expectancy increased by 20 years because of modern medicine. So if the white rule was as bad as the media has told the world that it was, why were so many blacks from all over Africa flooding in to this small white little enclave to have their piece of the pie, to get some Western civilization, to earn money, to have the benefits of Western civilization? If the white population was treating them so badly and murdering them by their thousands, why did their population grow by such an enormous amount? 920% is an enormous amount of increase. And that is what it increased by in 50 years. So in the 1960s, we finally got our independence from Britain and became the Union of South Africa. Now, at that time, the British then amalgamated all these different homelands into one union, which was South Africa. So the small white minority now had to find a way to make this disparate and warring groups of people, because the blacks do not like other tribes. To this day, they fight amongst themselves. So they war amongst themselves. They don't like each other. How was this small community of whites meant to make this union of warring and different tribes work? That was when they gave them homelands. They said, okay, you don't like each other, and you don't like us, and there are more of you than of us, so you need a homeland for yourself. And to this day, the Zulus still have Zululand, where they are ruled over by their own king. They have many sub-chiefs, and they were given Zululand, which is part of Natal. Now, if you look at the rainfall area in South Africa and you overlay that on a map of the black homelands, you will be able to see that the South African government, as the mainstream have told you, they did not give arid desert land to these black tribes. They gave them good arable land. Natal is the most fertile area in South Africa, and yet they gave the majority of that as Zululand to the Zulus, where they still live to this day. They did not put them in areas where they could not support themselves. They did not oppress them. They said, live under your own rules, with your own people, and you can come and work and earn money in our country, our little white enclave. So there was an uneasy peace between the blacks and the whites, which came to a head in the 1960s or thereabouts, when there was the Soweto riots, which was caused by School kids, they did not want to be taught in Afrikaans. They wanted to be taught in their own languages. Now, there was no written African language in Africa at all. They didn't have words for things like maths. They didn't have scientific words. They don't even have a word for tomorrow or yesterday. So to demand to be taught in their own language was a very big ask when their languages did not encompass education, and they didn't have teachers. They didn't at that stage. They may have had a Bible translated into their language, but I'm not sure of the dates when that happened. So the cause for this rioting is very strange to me. However, they rioted, and they started burning down schools and blockading streets and stoning policemen. And this is where the major problems started. So there's this iconic picture of a young black child being carried out of the smoke-laden streets where he was killed by the South African Defence Force. And that set the world on fire against the white South Africans. But I'm not excusing it. I'm simply trying to explain it from a South African point of view. In South Africa at that time, we were fighting the communists on our borders. Now, the armed wing of the African National Congress was called Mkhonto Sizwe, the spear of the nation. Now, they were being trained in Angola, one of our bordering countries, by the Cubans and by the Russians. They were being trained in how to conduct guerrilla warfare and literally to terrorist warfare, how to scare the population. And at the same time, we were having these riots and looting, murdering, etc., in our own streets, in our own homes. So our defense force was spread very thin, and we're fighting a war and a civil war at the same time in our country. And they may have overreacted a little to certain things, but as I say, I am not forgiving it. I'm just giving you a historical perspective on what happened. So, at this time came the rise of our Saint Nelson Mandela, and he, who was so badly treated by the South Africans, he got a law degree in a South African university. So the story that we didn't educate the blacks and that we treated them so badly is straight away in conflict with the facts, because he and Mahatma Gandhi got an education in South Africa and became lawyers. So, you need to think about that when you think about the fact that we just left them in this barren land, unable to feed themselves, and we did nothing to help them. Anyway, the ANC was rising, and Nelson Mandela became the face of the ANC, and they were becoming more militant by the day, and the white South African was becoming under threat from the people within his borders. So we became harder on them. They became more militant. They attacked us. We attacked them. And it became an absolute mess in South Africa. Now, Nelson Mandela has become a hero all over the world as a freedom fighter and a man of peace. But he was a paid-up member of the Communist Party. And when he was arrested the first time, he was arrested for treason and acts against the state. And he was acquitted the first time and rearrested some years later. And there were 170-something charges against him of acts against the state, violence, incitement to violence, all kinds of uh, treasonous activities. And in court, he pled guilty to more than 150 of those charges. He pled guilty to them. He admitted that, yes, he was forming an army against the state, and he was not sorry about it, because in his famous speech at court, he said that he was perfectly happy to die for his cause. And he was then sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, in any other country at that time, had he committed those acts, he would probably have been sentenced to death. But the South African government did not want to create a martyr, so he and the cohorts who were with him were sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, the pictures that you see of Nelson Mandela in prison are in this tiny little cell on Robben Island where he spent his days breaking rocks and being terribly treated. Maybe so for the first 10 or so years of his imprisonment. In 1985, the national government went to see him, and they offered him unconditional freedom if he would agree to renounce violence, which he refused. He said he was not willing to, and he was kept in jail. But he was moved off of Robben Island into Pollsmoor Prison, which is a high security prison, but a much better place to live. And shortly after that, he was given what is called a bungalow on the grounds of the prison. Well, it was not a bungalow. It's a very nice house with his own chef, his own valet. He received visitors from all over the world at this house. He had a swimming pool. He was treated extremely well, and that is how he lived out the end of his prison sentence in South Africa. Anyway, Nelson Mandela was then nominated by the world and by the ANC as the face of his party. So in the 1980s or thereabouts, the National Party, under immense pressure from the outside world, who had instituted horrific sanctions against South Africa, we had no access to outside technology, arms, ammunition, petrol, which you call gas. We had no access to anything from the outside world. We had to rely on ourselves. Now, the whites in South Africa proved themselves to be very innovative, very creative people. They found a way to create petrol out of coal, of which we have an abundance in South Africa. They invented and created the most incredible arms, helicopters, military vehicles, land to sky missiles. They invented the most incredible things that we were self-sufficient. But if you are fighting a war in your own country and on your borders, you need petrol. And we could not get petrol. We were at the same time assisting the Rhodesians, who had a civil war in their country. We were assisting them with everything that they couldn't get from the outside world. And it just became impractical, financially impossible. Our government was fast going broke, as I understand things. And we needed to call a truce with the outside world. Now, the red line that could not be crossed, according to the American government at that time, was that we had to call an end to apartheid and free Nelson Mandela. And those were non-negotiable rules for what had to happen. So in 1992, the government had been negotiating with the ANC, and they went to the white population because they were the only people with a vote at that time. And they asked the following question: should we we continue our negotiations with the ANC. Now, the understanding of that was that they would continue to negotiate with the ANC and that we would have power sharing in the country. Not that we would hand over the country to black rule, but that the blacks would have a say in their future in the country, but the whites would equally have a say to their future in the country. So, given that question, they went to a referendum, and there was an incredibly huge voter turnout. 85% of the voting population turned out to vote in this referendum. And more than 80% of the vote was yes, we should continue to negotiate with the ANC with a view to power sharing. Well, that was in 1992. By 1994, the country was turned over to the ANC. Nelson Mandela was our first president, and the beginning of the end was written. I mean, the rest is almost history now, because we were tricked, connived, lied to, sold down the river, and the end result was the African National Congress, a communist party, took over South Africa. Now, until that day, the world press was full of stories of South Africa. There were concerts where people waved their lighters in the air, free Nelson Mandela, free the oppressed African, free, end apartheid, end this oppressive white rule. And suddenly, in 1994, the world went silent. Silent. And from that day to this, there is not a word in the mainstream media worldwide about what is happening in South Africa today.
I think the first time I realised that something was wrong in South Africa from my English perspective, with blinkers on, was when I read about a device that they were selling for people living in Johannesburg, that if somebody tried to rob you while you were in your car at the traffic lights, or the robot as you call them, that
Yes.
Gas lit underneath the car and burnt the people to death who were trying to rob you. And I thought, and apparently it was selling really well as a self-protection device, and I had no idea that things could deteriorate so much in a country like South Africa, which looked, from when I had geography lessons at school, like being a visual paradise of abundant loveliness. And so to hear the stories that you've just been telling, could I ask, for instance, why was it that the world has wanted to portray things as they have? What was the motivation of Russia, Cuba, the press, governments worldwide to act in such a way?
Well, we'll probably never know the real motive, but Clive, to me, it's always follow the money. South Africa is rich in every single mineral possible to man. It has everything. It has magnesium, it has steel, it has copper, it has diamonds, it has gold, it has everything except oil, which they probably do have, it just hasn't been found yet. But they have everything. Now, the Afrikaners had built it up into an incredibly first world, beautiful, productive country. It was South Africa, together with Rhodesia, another British colony, were the breadbasket of Africa. They produced so much food that they were exporting thousands of tons every year to the rest of the world and to the rest of Africa. They were productive, they were beautiful. South Africa has to be, and has been voted again this year, one of the most beautiful countries in the world. It is. It has everything. It has miles and miles and miles of golden sand beaches. It has warm, one coastline on the east coast is fed by a warm current coming from Mozambique. So you have warm seas. You can grow anything in some areas of South Africa. You can go from snow-covered mountains where you can ski. We've got desert. It is the most beautiful country. And it was a first world, productive, incredibly wonderful, beautiful country. Everything worked. Everything worked. We had wonderful roads, wonderful rail service. We had everything. It was incredible. And in the 21 years since the ANC took over, it has become worse than a banana republic. So you were talking about when you come to a standstill at a robot. The world cannot understand because I have not been anywhere where this happens. So you approach a traffic light and you stop. And your vehicle is immediately surrounded by 20 black people. Now, this one is selling scarves, and that one is selling clothes hangers, and this one is trying to clean your windscreen. Now, this is the best of all. They spray your windscreen with some oily substance that they spray on it, and then wipe it with a dirty rag so that you cannot see through your windscreen. And you cannot leave your windows open. You cannot leave your doors unlocked. You cannot leave your handbag, which they call here a purse, on your front seat. You have to hide everything. You cannot leave a phone, a laptop in view because they will break your side window and steal whatever is in view on your seats. If your door is open, they will pull you out of the car and hijack your car. Whether your child is in it or not is immaterial. They will drive off with your vehicle. They just cluster around your vehicle, wanting to sell you oranges, apples, who knows what, and absolutely intimidate you because you know that they will break the window of your vehicle or drag you out of the car and take your vehicle away. You know that this is the likely outcome of what is happening there. And yet in every urban area in South Africa, you stop at a traffic light and this is what happens to you. So yes, I never saw any of these. I have seen them advertised, but I've never seen this device that will burn them. And I've actually never really seen pictures of anyone being attacked with these things. But I can understand if they were available and if people did do that. I can understand because my very own daughter was 8 months pregnant and was hijacked, pulled out of her car, kicked and beaten, and the car taken away. Luckily, her other child, was not in the car at the time. And this is the story of every white person in South Africa. They themselves, or someone in their family, or in their circle of friends, have been hijacked, raped, carjacked, burgled, but we'll get to the burglaries in a minute, or in some way attacked by the other populace, because we have a target on our backs, and the target is our white skins. Nobody is going to ask you, did you treat the blacks badly during the apartheid years? Were you a liberal? Are you English? Are you Afrikaans? Are you a Boer? Do you vote for the ANC? They're not going to ask you those questions. You are white, and that is enough reason to attack, torture, and murder you.
Wow. Oh, that's just very shocking, very frightening. So,
And
sorry.
yes, Clive, sorry.
Well, it was just a minor point, but what happens when they spray your windscreen and you can't see? What do you do then?
You keep a soapy concoction in your windscreen water and hope that by the time the robot changes, you'll have got it clean enough to be able to see, because you cannot get out of your car. You're not going to get out of your car and clean it from the outside. So it's a nightmare. Daily life for whites in South Africa is a nightmare. Can you imagine a country where before you leave for work in the morning, you have to check the news to see where there are riots, where they've barricaded the roads, where there are stolen vehicles, Can you go your normal route to work or can you not? I mean, it's an absolute nightmare. I was driving home. I worked in the casinos, and I was driving home in the early hours of one morning. They stand on an overpass above the roads, and they throw bricks at your car. So your windscreen breaks, and you have to stop. And they have another little gang waiting at the bottom, a little way forward, to attack you as you get out of your vehicle, to try and sort your vehicle out. So if they break your windscreen, or they put an obstacle in the road that flattens your tires, you do not stop. You keep going, because you know that they are waiting for exactly that. Have you heard of a country where there are road signs up that say hijack zone or rape zone? Be cautious. They have these road signs in South Africa that say those things, and the government doesn't have police patrolling those known spots. You take your chances. Bad luck for you.
How much of South Africa is safe these days?
No,
Wow.
no.
So what's happened to the
It's not a mess.
what's happened to the
What is that?
what's happened to the tourist industry?
Well, Clive, the tourist industry until recently was pretty healthy. I think it contributes an enormous amount to the GDP of the country because a tourist goes on a beaten track. You know that, and I know that. They are kept away from the squatter camps and the bad areas. The cities like Cape Town used to be, they are not so much more in the last 18 months or so, but they used to be kept fairly safe because the country depends on tourism. So if you do not step off the beaten tourist track, you will come back having had a wonderful holiday because the rand is worth nothing to any other currency. So if you, as an American, go to South Africa, your dollar is worth 17 rand, and you can stay in five-star hotels and frequent the best places where you will be relatively secure. Recently, a busload of American tourists was attacked, and they were forced off the bus at gunpoint and robbed. There have been tourists on hiking trails that get raped and their bodies are found. These things do happen, but in the main, tourists are relatively safe because they only go to the tourist areas. So. But there has been a huge decline in the tourist industry because the government has instituted rules that you cannot enter the country with a child unless it has its long form birth certificate, its unabridged birth certificate. I believe they turned Bill Gates and his daughter away because she didn't have that birth certificate when she tried to enter South Africa. So they're shooting themselves in the foot with all the rules and regulations. And it's becoming difficult. But also, the country is becoming more and more, by the day, more violent, more mob-ruled. And so even this previously relatively safe areas are now no longer safe. So it's a very sad picture of a country where everything was first world and beautiful. Our streets are now more potholes than streets, and the government is not doing anything about it. If you want the potholes fixed, they have put out in the newspapers how you can set about it yourself, fixing the potholes in your roads. And groups of people do go and do that because they can't stand the damage to their vehicles. But the government doesn't do it. So, and you have e-tolls, which are toll roads, and you have them every couple of miles, so you're paying enormous road usage taxes that are not being used for that. Our fabulous rail service has become a disaster because the blacks in South Africa use a lot of trains for commuting. So if the train in the morning is overfull or if it's late, they will burn that train. You can find pictures of it all over the internet. They will burn the train. So the following day, there's one less train. So the trains are overfull and the trains are late. So they burn another one. So the Minister of Transport then decided, well, we will put out a couple of billion rand tender for new trains in South Africa. So they put out the tender to Spain, and the engineers in Spain warned them. They said these trains will not run on the South African tracks because they are too tall. They won't go under the overpasses and they won't go under the bridges. They will not work in South Africa. But I'm assuming kickbacks. They signed this multi-billion rand tender and got the first trains, which lo and behold, wow, they don't run on the South African tracks. They get derailed at the first overpass or bridge. So we have these trains now, brand new, sitting there rusting because they can't run. So they instituted an investigation into how this happened, and the chief engineer in charge of railways turns out to not be an engineer at all. He doesn't have an engineering degree. He doesn't have anything to suit him for that position. But he was in charge of billions of taxpayer money and did this thing. Now he, as far as I know, is on paid leave until the investigation is completed. So that is just one sample of every department in South Africa being a wreck, an absolute wreck. Our President Zuma, did not attend one day of school in his entire life. He was taught to read and write by a school dropout. He was a goat herder for his father, and as I say, he never went to school. But because he was in charge of the armed wing, he was some high up in the armed wing of the ANC, he has been voted in as president of the country. So you can understand why the country is going to hell in a handbasket, because this man can't read or write or even do sums. There are many videos out there laughing at him because he cannot read a number over two figures out loud. When he comes to trying to read 1,753,927, it will take him 20 minutes to be able to decipher that number. He talks about 11,000 and so on. It is beyond my belief, or beyond anybody's belief, what is happening in that country. But I would like to get to the stories of the farm murders, the murders of whites, the torture and murder of whites, and the number of whites who are now living in poverty because of the reverse racism that is going on in that country. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to sort of branch out into that.
Yes, absolutely. Go right ahead.
So when the ANC came into power, one of the first things they did was disband the commandos, which is a civilian force which was there to protect the farmers, because as is normal, farms are outlying, they're in unprotected areas, and we had a commando system in place which protected the farms. They had CB radios, and they would react instantly to any call for help by a farmer. So that was one of the first things they did. The second thing they did was they confiscated the whites' firearms, and they said that you needed to hand in your firearm to the police departments and apply for a new license under the new government. Well, there are people who have been waiting 20 years for their new license, and their firearms are supposedly in safes in police custody. However, every year there come reports of 20,000 or more of these confiscated firearms disappearing. Now, it has become common knowledge that the police will sell one of these firearms to somebody. Now, if you go into dealings with a policeman to buy a firearm, it is more than likely that you don't want it for upright hunting purposes or self-protection. However, the police will sell these firearms to these people, criminals, and there is even a system in place where they will rent you a firearm for as a small amount, as something like $11 a day. They will rent you a firearm, which you will then return at some future stage. And firearms have also disappeared from the SADF, the Defense Department. They have disappeared by their tens of thousands from them. So that whole system has left the whites, legal firearm owners, unable to defend themselves. Because under the old government, you had to register your firearm. You couldn't buy a firearm until you had a license for it. So when the ANC took over, they had this list of registered owners. They knew who you were, where you lived, and they knew what you had. So it was easy to institute the confiscation of firearms. Then the next thing they did was institute affirmative action, which was to uplift the previously disadvantaged and to give them a fair chance at work in South Africa, which sounds well and good. But AA, affirmative action, soon became Black Economic Empowerment, and today it is broad-based Black Economic Empowerment, BBBEE, which has got more than 119 laws which exclude white people from the workplace absolutely. The government have said quite openly that they will keep government positions and municipal positions open rather than employ whites. And Eskom, the Electricity Supply Commission for South Africa, which has the monopoly on electricity in South Africa, they were recently told that they need to pay off another 3,000 some hundred white employees and replace them with blacks. Now, you would think that Eskom, that has fallen apart, they cannot supply enough electricity for South Africa. And this last winter, they were what they call load shedding. They just tell a certain area every day, we are shutting your area off for however many hours, which can be up to 3-4 days, up to a week. We are shutting off electricity to your area for that time. Because we can't supply it, because they haven't maintained or built any new power stations since 1994. The power stations are covered in ash, which comes from the coal that they fire them with. The equipment is deteriorating and rotting because the ash has some acidic content in it, but they haven't cleaned it out. So it's been there for 20 years and is destroying everything in sight. Anyway, these rolling blackouts were then a roadmap for criminals because they knew that this area is not going to have power for X amount of hours or X amount of days. Now, a white South African, if they have any money whatsoever, they live like this. They have 8-foot walls around their houses. They have electric wire on top of the 8-foot walls. They have burglar bars on every window. They have an alarm system. They have burglar bars on their doors. They have security gates. They have a security gate between the house and the sleeping area so they can lock themselves in at night. They have an alarm system connected to an instant response people. And sometimes they have a guard patrol in the streets, paid for by the local people. Now, if you have any money, that is how you can live. But when the electricity is going to be off for X amount of days, your gate battery runs flat, you cannot run your alarm system, your computer doesn't work, your cell phone goes flat, you have no access to the outside world whatsoever. And you are a sitting duck. Now, a burglary in South Africa works like this. They do not they're not opportunistic. They don't look for a time when you will be out of your house, come and rob you, and get the hell out of there as fast as they can with their stolen goods. No, they wait until you are at home. They then come into your house, tie you up, rape the mother and the children in front of the father and the sons. They rape you with broken bottles. They rape you with broomsticks. They burn you with hot irons. They press your face against a red hot plate on your stove. They burn you, they pour oil down your throat, and they set it alight. They then, when the mother, the daughter, succumb to, anyway, they will then take the children and murder them. They have been known to hang children from the rafters in the house. They have drowned children in boiling water. They have raped 3-month-old babies to death while the father is tied up and forced to watch and be helpless to help his family. Then, if they are merciful, they will kill the father. But in most instances, they do not. They allow that man to live that horror day after day after day for the rest of his life, knowing that he, the protector of his wife and family, failed them through no fault of his own. But I cannot imagine that man's mind and how he faces every new day. I can't begin to imagine living with that. And if the wife or the daughter survives the horror and the trauma inflicted on them, they then are almost guaranteed to have AIDS, which is a death sentence. And how do they live? How do they face every new day? I don't know. And the hospitals in South Africa where these people are forced to go are worse than death traps. They have no medicine, no beds, no linen, no food. You go to a hospital, you take your own linen, you take your own mattress, which they might put on a floor in a corridor and force you to share it. I don't know why people go to the hospitals at all, because unless you can afford a private hospital, that is what is inflicted on you. They imported Cuban doctors into South Africa because the white doctors had left. And there were Cuban doctors running prostitution rings in the hospitals. They were raping patients in the hospitals and paying the Cuban doctors for that. So 80,000 and more white South Africans have been tortured and murdered by these people in the last 20 years. We don't know how many, because the death certificate will read, died of natural causes. So we don't know how many actually, because the police are the only ones allowed to report on crime in South Africa. They never report by race or by farm attacks, for instance. It is simply deaths. So there is no way of knowing how many whites actually have been killed in this way. The only numbers that we know for sure are 4,000 farm attacks. Now, last year, there were 278 farm attacks and 68 farmers were murdered. That makes farming in South Africa the most dangerous job in the entire world, because they report those kind of deaths by the numbers per 100,000. And last year, the number of farmer deaths rose to 132 per 100,000, which is 4 times the number of police deaths in South Africa. So these farmers are not only disarmed, abandoned because they don't have anyone taking care of them, they are being murdered, tortured, killed at a rate that is unbelievable in the world that we live in today. And nobody is doing anything about it or even talking about it. So the other thing, there's another danger facing the South African farmers, and that is land redistribution. The government decided that too much land was owned by whites in South Africa, which has been disproven time and time and time again by many people, by AfriForum, by independent investigators. However, this is the story that is told to the blacks in South Africa, that the whites stole the land from the blacks, and we own 80% of the land in South Africa. Now, the white population is approximately 3.5 million. We also don't know exact figures because they're not available, but approximately 3.5 million. And the entire population is about 70 million. So we are less than, the white people are less than 8% of the population of South Africa. And that tells you exactly that we cannot own 80% of the land in that country. However, this is being used as a method by the ANC government to inflame the blacks against the whites, and is used as a reason for murder because it was said by a government minister, Julius Malema, that you cannot steal from a white. You are simply taking back what belongs to you. So the farmers are now left to their own devices. They don't have protection. They cannot protect themselves because the laws in South Africa say that if somebody comes into your house at 3 o'clock in the morning, he breaks through the roof and he comes into your house and he tells you he's looking for work, you may not attack him. You may not defend yourself. And if you do, he is not the one who will be arrested. You will be arrested for manslaughter or murder, which is happening more and more in that country right now. But now the law says that if some black person stakes a claim on your farm, which has been in your family for generations, and they say that some ancestor of theirs herded goats on that property 300 years ago, they don't have to prove that. Not at all. They can put in a land claim on your property, and your property will be handed over to this black claimant with a promise of reimbursement from the government. But there are also farmers whose farms have been taken away who are still waiting 15 years later for reimbursement. Now, many productive farms have been handed over to these black claimants. And within 2 years of the farm being handed over, there is not a tree standing. The house has been demolished. The place is an arid wasteland. And that is what is happening to the farmers in South Africa. Now, the general populace. There are 119 race-based laws excluding the whites from the job market. So, if you lose your job for whatever reason, you are laid off in order to replace you by 4 black people or whatever, you cannot ever get another job. You cannot get a job. So, even if you were upper middle class, an engineer, for instance, and you lived in a good area, in a good home, and sent your children to good schools, your savings will only carry you so far, and then you are done. So you will lose your home. Your children will not be able to go to the schools. You will eventually lose your car, so you can't even live in it. Now, what are you going to do? Because as a white person, you get no help, No government grants, no nothing. Now, because of the BEE laws in South Africa, every company has to get a scorecard. So many times a year, you get a scorecard from the government, which gives you points for having enough blacks. You must have 80% black from management level down to bottom level. Every level of your company must be 80% black. You get points for giving to black charities. You get penalized for giving to a charity that has less than 80% black people. So companies cannot even give to white charities. You cannot register a charity in South Africa that only gives to whites. You cannot do it. They will not give you a non-profit number. So these people are left totally to their own devices. And they are found in funny little compounds, living under little pieces of canvas or in cardboard boxes or whatever, off the beaten track, trying to survive. So they then form together in camps. Now, they are called squatter camps, but it is not true. They are not squatters on any land. They are black squatter camps where the blacks have just pulled in, built houses, shacks, whatever, on land that does not belong to them. The white camps are on land either donated or rented by white people sympathetic. So these people now have a piece of land that they can go to, but they don't have anywhere to shelter them from the storm. They build their houses out of wood, out of pieces of tin, out of road signs, out of canvas, out of whatever they can get their hands on, and they live in these. But they have no access to food, and they can't send their children to school. Because in South Africa, you pay for school. You pay for transport to school, and you have to wear a school uniform. There are no feeding schemes at the schools either. So if you don't have a home to live in, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you cannot afford school. You can't get your kids there. You can't buy the uniforms and the shoes or the books, and you can't afford the school fees. So we have approximately 1/3 of the white population of 3.5 million. We have an estimated 1 million and growing by the day living in these dire, dire circumstances where they have no access to anything. They don't have running water. They don't have toilets. They don't have anything. They don't have any means of medical care. They have nothing. Nothing. And charities are not allowed to help them. So the situation and the outlook for whites in South Africa is beyond dire. As I said, there's an estimated number of 80,000 whites having been tortured, murdered, whatever, in South Africa in the last 20 years. Now, I cannot for the life of me, and I've said this before on this program, but I'm saying it again, I cannot for the life of me understand why the world has turned a deaf ear and a blind eye to these people in such dire need of help. I just cannot understand it.
Has the mainstream picked it up at all? I mean, because before I'd, sort of, well, it's been so recent that I've heard of any of this. No, I had no
No,
idea.
Clive, no. There is not, that's what I say, worldwide blackout on this. There is nothing anywhere. You will hear recently there was the whole Rhodes Must Fall riots by the blacks in South Africa. That hit worldwide media. I mean, even the latest report, I'm sorry, I can't remember who issued this report. But I think it's Amnesty International, one of those people, issued a report a week or so ago where they talk about xenophobic attacks on blacks in South Africa. They do not mention white genocide. Now, Dr. Gregory Stanton, who is the top man in Genocide Watch, which is a very, very left leaning group based in the USA, which keeps an eye on countries at risk for genocide. He was persuaded by a very staunch South African supporter, a Dutch reporter who now lives in Holland but did live in South Africa for a very long time. She hounded this man to go and do an investigation in South Africa, and he's been there 3 times. His report put South Africa originally on a stage 5 of 8 levels of genocide. Then they put it up to a 6, which is the preparation level. 7 is full out genocide, and 8 is the denial phase. So South Africa is on a stage 6 of 8 so it's in the preparation level for genocide in South Africa. And he promised in a video speech that he would bring our plight to the attention of the United Nations, of Amnesty International, and of governments worldwide, which I do believe he has done, but there has been no follow-up anywhere. A South African group, Front National, went to the United Nations. They got accreditation to speak for the white South Africans, and they have asked the United Nations, now this was a year and a half ago, to please do something, send a delegation to South Africa, and please investigate. Nothing has as yet been done. Another group went to the unrepresented nations of the world, UNPO, I think it's called. They went there and spoke on behalf of white South Africans, asking for self-determination, that they could once more have a little spot of South Africa to call their own, where they could rule themselves and take care of themselves. Well, so far nothing has come of that either. Then this week, another white political party in South Africa had finally got to have meetings with the police force and the government, where they have agreed to prioritize farm murders. But what one has to understand about that is this is the run-up to an election. So they will say anything that looks good, and nothing will happen, because it has been agreed before that they will look into it. And the outcome was that the poor in South Africa, the white poor in South Africa, are so small that you can't even number them, so they don't need to take notice of that. And farm murders, blacks get attacked as well as whites, and so they don't need to look into that. So that has been the outcome of previous so-called investigations, and I don't expect it to be any different this time. So there is nobody, and I mean nobody, worldwide who is willing to even investigate our allegations. They don't have to believe it. They just have to go and look, but they will not, for reasons known only to themselves.
Well, it's just incredible. So what about the diaspora? Because the white South African diaspora seems to be everywhere. How many of them are even aware of what's going on now?
Clive, no, this is also my opinion, but I understand it. I don't condone it, but I understand it. They're out. They're free. They no longer live in fear. They're no longer under threat. They're okay. They have a job. They can take care of their families, and they're safe. And they don't want to jeopardize that by speaking out. So they don't. And whilst I can understand that, I just can't go that route myself. And I have spoken to many South Africans near where we live, and that seems to be the thing. I'm okay, Jack. I'm all right, Jack. So tough luck you're having. And those that have tried have realized the heart-wrenching sadness that comes with trying and not even being acknowledged, because we have written to every single congressman in this country and told him and given proof of what is happening in South Africa. And not one letter has even been acknowledged, much less something done about it. So I can understand how one gets tired, dispirited, and gives up. I can understand that. But personally, I can't go that route. I can't turn my back on 3.5 million people who are being oppressed, disenfranchised, their language being taken away, their monuments being pulled down, their holy days and holidays being taken away, the history of their people being removed from school textbooks, they're being tortured and murdered. How do you turn your back on that? I can't.
No, no. Well, one can't. Um, I think if I was out there, the first thing I'd be trying to do would be to get to the tourists and say, "Look, you got to come and film this. You've got to spread this. This is the most exciting holiday you're ever going to have, because you're going to have real excitement, and try and get the word out that way."
Well, a group in America, the American Freedom Party, took our cause to their heart, and they sent a delegate, a very well-known writer and speaker, Paul Fromm. They sent him to South Africa on a fact-finding mission. He was there for 2 weeks. He went to the camps. He saw all of these things, and he came back. Now, he was scheduled to address the American Freedom Party at a gathering on his fact-finding mission. He's a Canadian, and he has been denied entry to the US ever since he went to South Africa. Now, he has traveled here once a month for the past 5 years, and suddenly he was denied access to the USA, and he's not allowed to come here. So people see that this is the result of trying to help South Africans, and most people seem to have a very strong sense of self-preservation and are scared of their governments. They are scared of their government. And so they step back and don't do it. They just don't do it. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I started very small. I started with Blog Talk Radio. I started with anybody that was prepared to listen. I've been on more than 250 shows. I have 2 radio shows of my own weekly. I don't know what more I personally can do, but at least I'm trying. I have a fund where we help people who have applied for asylum in the USA. I have another fund where we try and get help people with the airfare and the means to get out of South Africa if they get accepted by any other country, which is also very hard to happen. It doesn't happen easily. I raise funds for a South African Family Relief Project, which is an incredible charity which does enormous amounts of good work in the white squatter camps in South Africa. They help 480 camps. They help them with food, with medicine, with care for the children. They've put concrete flooring in a camp where the government put white squatters on an unreconstituted rubbish tip. That was where they think these whites should live. They've put flooring in there. They're trying to put a clinic up for the kids, a daycare center, etc. They've planted grass. They feed and clothe these people. But it is a drop in the ocean. No one unregistered volunteer organization can get to everybody. So these are the people that I support, that I try and help. I don't know. Even the Red Cross is not allowed to help whites in South Africa. They've been told that they can help the black squatter camps, but if they are helping exclusive white camps, they will be denied access to South Africa. And that we heard from one of the top people in the USA.
Okay, so can't the boss of the Red Cross be taken out, or in the sense that interviewed and confronted with that question in some way that they can't wriggle out of it. Surely, you know, that's a pretty big one, the Red Cross.
Clive, who's going to do it? We need somebody like the BBC or Fox News or somebody to do that, because we need, you know, my mail is full of hate mail, that I tell lies and I talk rubbish, and I deserve to be taken out, and the whites in South Africa deserve it because of apartheid, and ain't karma a bitch, and payback is horrific, etc. This is what my mail is full of. So I don't see that the head of the Red Cross is going to agree to be interviewed by me, and they'll fudge the answer because they want to admit to it, because then their funding worldwide will decrease.
So
you follow the money every time. Follow the money.
So what? Sorry, I was thinking aloud. I think there must be some indisputable proof that could somehow get through to the mainstream, but I suppose it's that controlled that perhaps it can't. But it's such a big thing.
It's huge. It is huge. We have thousands of photographs of the mutilated bodies of these torture victims. We have hundreds of thousands of photographs of the squatter camps. We have documented proof. We have videos. A BBC guy, oh man, I can't remember his name, did a BBC, a two-part series on the white squatter camps in South Africa. But it wasn't taken seriously. And I mean, people have tried. They have tried. But it just, I don't know. It gets buried.
Well, I suppose as the world is happily ignoring the 13 million displaced people in Syria and bombs still going off, that they can ignore South Africa just as easily. I mean, the world is asleep, unfortunately, in general, and doesn't realise that World War III is going on if you're living in the wrong part of the world.
Well, Clive, in my opinion, South Africa was the blueprint for the rest of it. I think it was an experiment to see whether they could get away with all of this and without interference. And it has worked perfectly. So they rolled it out worldwide recently, but much faster than it happened in South Africa. In South Africa, it's taken 21 years to get to this situation where the white population could be wiped out in 48 hours. It could. So then they saw it worked, and it's rolled out now. I mean, you see Europe being overrun. You see the USA being overrun. You see the results of open borders. You see the government's not prepared to step in to help their own population. So the blueprint was South Africa. And I've been screaming that from the rooftops. Look at South Africa to know what is going to come to your country any day now. Well, now it's too late because it's there. It's happened.
I was speaking to a friend of mine who, for 25 years, was an English soldier in the army. And I said to him, "What was your job description?" And he said it was to keep England safe from invaders. And I said, what do the army do now? And he said the exact opposite. They help them come in.
Yes, that is their job today, is to stand at the border and hand them food stamps as they get here, and a passport and work permits. And I mean, I don't know, Clive, for a white South African, to leave, because if 1 million of them do not have any money, they cannot leave, number one. But number two, if they do have the means to leave, to immigrate anywhere in this world as a white South African is practically impossible.
Wow.
There is not a country that is saying, look, you are good, solid, hardworking, tax-paying citizens. Your morals align with ours. Your ethics align with ours. Please, come and contribute to our country. There is nowhere that is willing to do that. Some friends of mine flew out on Monday night to Ireland on a holiday. They had the invitation letter from a friend. They had accommodation set up. Their families, between them, raised the money for them to go away because they work in one of these charities that work with the camps. They were beyond repair, traumatized from all of this. So their families raised the money for them to go. They landed in Dublin. Because they could not show that they had means or a credit card to support themselves, they were turned around right there at the airport, and in 9 hours they were on their way back to South Africa. That is how welcome we are anywhere.
Well, it's horrendous. I mean, the fact is that I believe that all the countries, England, America, have created the refugee crisis, like all governments do. The South African government has created this crisis, and it gets to the point where it becomes increasingly difficult to solve. I'm always the optimist, so I believe that everything will work out all right, and I can see some positivity, but from the perspective of the whites, have they got enough left, enough farms or whatever, that they could somehow create their own state, be it small or whatever, just so life can get on as normal? What are the chances of that?
There are two schools of thought amongst South Africans. The one are looking actively and vigorously for self-determination. They want their own state. They believe it's possible, and they are fighting for that. Now, I don't know what to think. I don't know what to think. They are going to have to take those one third of their population and uplift them to a degree where they can become productive citizens again. They're going to have to take a whole generation of children and teach them from the very beginning to read and write and basic essentials. They're going to have to teach those children. I don't know that the remaining 2 million, of which a lot are elderly and a lot are children, are going to have the means to do that. Because there were 120,000 operative farms in South Africa in 1994. There are now less than 30,000. So they've just gone through an incredible period of the drought, because South Africa works in cycles, 7 years of rain and 7 years of drought. They have just gone through the most terrible drought. And there are food shortages. But now you take that burgeoning population, 920% increase in population, and an equal decrease in the number of farmers. What is the end result of that? It's going to be Zimbabwe on steroids, because Zimbabwe is starving. Zimbabwe has nothing. I mean, they're done for because of Mad Bob and throwing the farmers out of there. So I don't know what to think about that story, but there is an organization that published 2 weeks ago that they are trying to get some land on the banks of the Danube, where the white population has diminished so badly because we don't breed as much as others. They are trying to obtain this land and send South Africans there. Now, it's still in negotiation stages, and I don't know whether this will work or not, but I'm hoping it will, because there was an influx of South African farmers to Georgia, not Georgia, United States, Georgia, Russia, and they are very successful there, and they're doing very well. So I'm hoping that this initiative works, that they can get these people out and give them a place of their own where they can run their own lives. But You say you're ever the optimist. I was very optimistic, but I'm becoming less and less so by the day, because it just seems that even if the world would give them a place, the ANC government probably won't let them go.
I'm sorry, I lost you there.
Oh, okay. I just said if the world would give the South Africans a place, I doubt that the ANC government would let them go, because they are making it harder and harder to get the paperwork that you require to leave the country. To get all the government departments have fallen into disarray. And so you need to get an unabridged birth certificate, an unabridged marriage certificate, a police clearance certificate, all of these kind of things to leave the country. Now, it is taking 18 months to get any of that paperwork out of the South African government, and becoming more difficult by the day. So I don't know that even if by some miracle we were allowed to leave, we were able to go somewhere else, I don't know that we would be given the means to leave our country.
Well, I suppose the traditional thing there is that somehow a means is found to buy one's way out. You know, as you said, it all comes down to money.
Money, it
Uh,
does. It does.
but it sounds a bit terminal for the country, in the sense that it sounds like everybody who's not on the right side is going to have to leave, which is horrendous. But perhaps I'm over dramatizing it. But by what you say, it sounds a
No,
bit like it.
no. You, Clive, you're not dramatizing it, because I haven't even touched on the corruption, the unbelievable fraud, downright theft uh, by the ANC government and by our president. I mean, when he was voted into power, he had 700 charges of fraud and corruption and things, and rape against him, and yet he was voted in as president, and those charges disappeared, and there he is, president of the country. So the gravy train is going to grind to a halt soon, because the taxpayer base just can't cope with it anymore. And then I don't know. I don't know what is going to happen. And they're heading into elections. The ANC is losing support from their disaffected black youth, who have over 52% unemployment. So, who are now turning to the economic freedom fighters, uh, run by Julius Malema, who is a young firebrand, who was the leader of the African National Youth Council. And he helped to oust President Mbeki and put President Zuma into power. And then they came to blows, literally, when he was head of the ANC Youth League. And he was expelled from the ANC party. And we thought we'd seen the end of him. No, he came back stronger than ever. He founded his own party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, who campaigned on the honeymoon is over for the whites. He campaigned on that. And he's the one who said that you can't steal from whites. You're just taking back what belongs to you. Now, he has a gazillion charges of fraud against him, and tender corruption and all kinds of things. He also owed the Revenue Service a ton of money, which also just disappeared recently. I mean, it's gone away. Now, the black youth idolized this man. And this Julius Malema has been to Cuba to find out how it should be done. And he is a student of Robert Mugabe's. And he believes that everything must be nationalized. Banks, insurance companies, private property, everything must be nationalized and redistributed to the blacks. Now, the ANC, because of all this fraud and corruption that has become so blatant that even the blacks in the country are beginning to turn their backs on the ANC, they are flocking to the EFF. So if this Julius Malema gets into power, the whites are done for, and they know that. They know that. Whether they have their own little enclave that belongs to them, ruled by them, they're still outnumbered 92 to 1, and it's not going to work. And they know that. But they are desperate for a viable solution. And it's either leave, which they can't, or stay and fight for their own homeland, which is what most of them have resigned themselves. A lot of them are militant about it, but others have just resigned themselves. Well, I can't leave, so this is the next best thing. So I don't know where the hope is for the country, for the people of the country, white and black alike, because the blacks have suffered untold poverty, hardship under this government. I don't know where the hope is for the country, but we have to keep on fighting and trying to find a solution.
Wow, that really is incredible. I mean, from the start, it's been amazing, and I heard an analogy that the original settlers were perhaps a little like the Amish in that they were peaceful and just wanted to get on with their lives and not be bothered by anybody, as I believe most people actually really want.
Well, they're still that way, Clive. You white South Africans are, in general, you cannot call everybody because there are different people in every community, but in general, they are the most law-abiding, peaceful, kind, hospitable, loving, God-fearing, hard-working, accept responsibility for yourself type of people you would ever hope to meet. They just want to be left in peace, to live their lives with their language, their history, their ethics, their morals, their God. They want to be left in peace. But they, throughout their 300 or more years of existence, have never found that. So I'm sorry for them. My heart bleeds for them because they deserve it. Their ancestors carved that wilderness into a first world, prosperous, wonderful country. And now their sons died protecting it on the borders against the communist onslaught. We fought the Rooi Gevaar, the Red Danger, on our borders. All our sons and brothers were conscripted into the army. All three of my brothers fought on the border in the border wars. And now for what? For what? So they cease to exist. They don't have a language, a heritage, a history, statues, nothing. The towns, the cities, the streets, everything, the holidays have all been renamed. The Afrikaner is going to cease to exist as a nationality, as a people. And that is so sad because there's the things they have done, right or wrong, no matter what happened along the way. They created a miracle out of nothing. And they deserve to have a part of that.
Well said, and I will do my best to spread this out to as many people as would like to listen. Perhaps you'd like to give all your contact details at this point, and explain, what people can do.
Well, there are two things you can do. The charity that I was telling you about. Now, I also need to explain just one thing. Trying to send goods to South Africa is an impossible task because the mail service is in disarray. They have been striking on and off for about 18 months. They've thrown all the mail into the streets. They've burnt the post offices down. They have done all kinds of things. Even the internal airline, the South African Airways, is refusing to fly any parcels around South Africa or out to the world because the South African Airways cannot pay their bills. So if you manage to get something to South Africa, it will be stolen in the post, or every parcel goes to the revenue service and they slap a tax on everything. So you send a donation of clothes or food or whatever to a charity and they have to pay an defined by the government tax on it. So it doesn't really help at all. The only thing that one can do that really helps is to send the money. So the charity that I support is South African Family Relief Project. And they have a web page where you can donate, but they post pictures every day of the latest things they've been doing. So you can see the reality of the squatter camps on their page, and you can see what they do to help these people. And their website is S for sugar, A, F for Freddy, R, P for Peter, S for sugar, A. South African Family Relief Project, SA.org. That is their webpage. And if you'd like to help people to get out of South Africa, which is what I do, and it costs about $3,000 to get one person out of South Africa, that's their visas and their airfare, or to help the people who have gotten out of South Africa and are seeking asylum but need help because they can't get work permits, etc., until their thing is resolved, you can go to my Radio Free South Africa webpage, which is Radio Free South Africa, all one word, .com. And there's a donate button on there where you can help these people. Other than that, my radio program is Radio Free South Africa on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com on a Saturday at 1 p.m. Central Time, or on Resolution Radio, which is a blog talk radio show, at 7 o'clock Central Time on a Monday evening. Or you can go to my YouTube channel, just Google Radio Free South Africa Karin Smith. I have about 28 YouTubes up where you can listen to or see a lot of South African patriots speaking, saying exactly what I say. Looking for solutions, you can listen to any of those and you will see that I'm not the only one saying the story. I'm just a facilitator for South Africans to speak out. So those are the only things that I can think of that you could maybe do to help. But please beware of charities. There are a lot of crooks in South Africa who are trying to make money off of the back of the suffering whites. And many of these charities have organizations where the money goes into the pocket of the people who run the charity, not to the people on the ground. I know the people from South African Family Relief, and they are all volunteers. The only thing that gets paid for them is the gas costs for them to go to the camps. Other than that, they do not get a salary. They do not get anything out of this charity that they do. They are volunteers, hardworking, caring people, and I know without a doubt that they are upfront.
Well, excellent. I'd like to ask a couple of questions, but first I'd like to just go back to what you were saying about HIV and being a death sentence, because it isn't. There are a number of ways to overcome viruses in general. Very, very high doses of vitamin C have been very successful. There's a material called GCMAF, that's been incredibly successful, reversing HIV in German and Swiss clinics. There are a number of things that can be done, because basically you're looking at a disease of deficiency. You know, the body will not succumb to a virus unless that body is deficient in nutrition. You know, you can. It's not the virus that you have to be worried about. It's your body's immune system and whether it's strong enough to overcome that virus. You know, it really isn't the virus to be scared of and to pay attention to. It is how strong is your immune system, and one can rebuild immune systems. It's just that, unfortunately, medical doctors aren't taught how. Well, one of the other things I wanted to mention was, if people want to help South Africans in general at this moment, and if they would decide to do that, for instance, next time they want to buy a bottle of wine, um, would that be a good idea? I imagine it would. And do they use chemicals a lot in South African agriculture or not?
Um, I know that they do use pesticides, but there's no GMO as such in South Africa.
You know, some countries,
So
yeah, some countries like Chile don't actually need too many chemicals because things like the Andes and so on keep a lot of the bugs from actually reaching Chile. I wondered whether, I mean, is it absolutely widespread like most of the world that they're using chemicals on anything that doesn't say organic?
yes,
Yeah, okay.
yes, it is because we have an incredible number of bugs in South Africa, simply because of the climate. Um, where things grow well is mainly subtropical areas. So yeah, we have bugs. I mean, things like malaria, which was wiped out in South Africa because we had the only malaria institute in Africa, in South Africa. When the ANC took over, they closed it down. So we are having things like tsetse fly and malaria and all those diseases which were more or less done away with are now resurfacing in South Africa. So it's not it's a holistic thing that is falling apart in that country. Everything is falling apart. You know, you can't touch on every aspect of it in one show because it's enormous. But healthcare is non-existent. But also caring for the things that would stop this happening has stopped happening. You know, they've stopped preventive things, and it's very scary to me. It is very scary to me because it's the last outpost of civilization in Africa, and it's disappearing fast.
And most governments align with other governments. Who is the current government of South Africa aligned with?
Chinese, well, they're BRICS. So they're Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the S is for South Africa. So the Chinese have bought up huge amounts of South Africa. They in the process of building their first military base, naval base actually. They have negotiated to bring in Chinese troops to protect their own people. In fact, and this is going to make you laugh, in 2008, a law was passed that the Chinese are black. So they are classified as black in South Africa so that they don't have to abide by the affirmative action or the BBBEE rules at all. They're immune from them because they are now black. And the other part of that is the Russians. Now, I spoke about the decline of the electricity services, and the Russians have now recently, Zuma went to Russia and struck a deal to build 6 nuclear power stations in South Africa, which the Russians are going to build. Now, I do not believe that the Russians are going to trust the Africans to run it, so we will have an influx of Russian people to do that. And then, of course, the Cubans, because uh, the ANC has always had very close ties with the Cubans. And recently, when they needed people to repair long neglected and uncared for army vehicles, they imported. They did not employ the whites who did the job before and had been laid off. They imported Cubans to do the job at an enormous cost. And a lot of the doctors in the South African hospitals have been replaced by Cubans. So those three are the main contenders right now, is Russia, China, and Cuba.
Right, right. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. One of the most interesting interviews I've ever had. Been lucky enough to listen to because I said virtually nothing and makes the job ludicrously easy. Yeah, I just want to say one thing because it's sort of interesting that the British are very good at concentration camps. Clearly it seems to have started with the Boer War, But my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, came to England as a refugee, and the first thing that the British did to welcome him in was to throw him in a concentration camp for the whole war. I thought it was really sweet of them. Free.
Clive, I wouldn't like this to come across as I am anti-British because I'm not. I'm of British descent on my mother's side. My mom has a British passport. Um, I and my father's side, I'm three, four, five generations of South African Afrikaner. I just grew up English because my mom's a Brit and my grandparents are British, and I. I'm often told I have a British accent. I don't have a South African accent, that's for sure. I know it's not British, but I can fool people if necessary. But I like the. I don't have an antipathy for the British. It is simply a matter of telling the facts of the history, and that is the history. Those are the facts, and I have no wish to change them to suit my agenda. You know what I mean? That is what the Brits did to the Boers, and I can't change that.
Well, it's a great shame
It,
that the British are
it is.
the British are an embarrassment. When I was at school, I went to the same school as Prince Charles. I was taught history, that the British were always right on all occasions in every war, and I believed it. I completely believed. They told us at school that we were the best people in the world, and we deserved it, and I totally believed it. I was completely taken in by the whole thing. And so,
Yes.
and
Yes.
now, age 61, I'm suddenly waking up to history. It was so boring at school. It was really dull. And it was a whole pack of lies.
That is the problem. That the whole education system worldwide is being taken over by I don't know what, and history is being rewritten to suit the New World Order agenda or whatever it is, and so people have no idea where they came from. They don't know where their roots are. They don't know the heroes of their past. They have no sense of identity or belonging, and that sets you adrift on a very, very wild sea. And that is sad. It is very sad because I have very strong roots. I know where I came from on both sides of the family. I know the history of both countries. I know who I am. And that gives you a basis for your life. But if you are cut adrift with no roots, I don't know how you self identify. And then from that comes everything else, I think.
Most people love their home, generally speaking. Most of the immigrants coming in to Europe actually would rather be at home having a lovely time with their family where they came from. It's just that because their homes have been bombed or whatever reason, that they can't go home. Just like the South Africans can't leave. The whole world,
Yes,
the whole world has to change now. The whole world at once has to decide to put the weapons down and to stop all this craziness. Money is a made-up concept. It's not as though it's backed with anything real. So we could easily say to the armies of the world that we'll pay you triple just to go home and help your families. Yeah, we'll pay you triple. We could easily do it. And
and
when the
Clive, is that not what everybody wants? Is that not what we, uh, as human beings, our first thing is for our family? Our priority is our family. We live for our family. We live to make their lives better. So, yes, that should work because every guy out there is fighting for a concept that he thinks is good for his family. And if we make him then come home and do it for his family, we'd be much better off.
even the nastiest criminal, I believe, would like their children to go to school in a nice, safe area. Nobody likes government. Everybody knows that governments, generally speaking, are totally corrupt. And in England, for instance, every year at Christmas, the government goes on holiday. Now, in I think it was Austria where there was no government for well over a year, and when the government goes on holiday in England at Christmas, no new laws get made. no wars get declared, generally speaking, and so long as they're not working, nothing gets worse. So my feeling is
Yes.
that after the Christmas holiday, we, the people of the world, should just say, "Don't bother to come back, thanks. If we need you, we'll call you. But in the meantime, we'll just get on with it." And I believe that we could reorganize money very easily, and all that has to change is one or two small things. One is that things have to be made to last again. After the Second World War, obviously, the American government decided that rampant consumerism was the thing to do, but it had been going on for longer than that. Back in I went to Edison's laboratory. The guy with Tesla who invented the light bulb. I went to his
Yes.
laboratory, and all his experimental light bulbs were still alight. 120 years later or whatever it was, because they were always built initially to last forever. But he realized there was no money in that, so the light bulb was, when it was actually manufactured, was deliberately made to only last 1,000 hours or whatever. And
Yeah, built-in
yeah,
obsolescence.
so the world, I've had probably 8 washing machines in my life. The first one was just as good as the last one, and so I had to work 8 times as hard, you might say, to buy 8 washing machines when one of them could have been infinitely repaired or upgraded. But actually, my washing machine 40 years ago was no more advanced than the one I have today. I mean, it really was not like computers. The washing machine really was just as efficient. And uh, I believe that we could just simply go back a little bit and say, okay, let's make things sensibly to last. Okay, it's going to cost 30% more, but it'll save 500% or 1,000% in the long run. And just realize that there is abundance, there's space for everybody. But right now, the psychopaths have taken the corporations, they've taken the media, they've taken government, they've taken leadership, and it's been like that way for thousands of years, really. And the only problem in the world, actually, because there are solutions to poverty, there's solutions to war, there's solutions to everything, the only problem in the world is there's one problem: it's psychopaths running it.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. And it is so obvious throughout the world right now. They are not there. They are definitely not there to care about what the people want or what the people think. They couldn't care less. They're there to line their pockets and further their agenda, whatever it might be.
And the thing is, there aren't many of them. We know where they live, and they don't have to die or anything, but they would be better suited to a job where they can't create suffering. One doesn't have to take away their estates and their chateaus. It's, they can carry on living, but they just can't run big companies
Yes.
and countries
It,
anymore. Nobody has to die. Nobody has to suffer, and the world would genuinely be better. And it could happen
much,
overnight. It could happen, you know, if everybody in the world realised that the only way it's going to work is everybody has to do it at once, which I think is the truth of it. 9 o'clock one morning, everything has to change. Everybody has to, all the
yes.
soldiers put their guns down. All the soldiers now get rewarded by being paid triple. We restart the economy. Things are made to last. We don't have to work nearly as hard. Any taxes that are demanded are, because we all agree that, yeah, we want whatever it is we think we want. You know, I mean, an 8-year-old, I was thinking of what like America's Got Talent or whatever it's called. Every country has a TV program where the idea is you look for the sweetest, most lovely person or people you can find in the country. The nicest grandmother, the woman who's so lovely that you just adore her as your granny, and you put her in charge of war. She's the minister of war, right? She's not going to make any. Right, simple as that. Yeah, you find the
Yep.
nicest people, and you say, "Look, I'm really sorry to inconvenience you, but would you mind being the Minister of Health?"
Yes.
I mean, how difficult is
Yes.
that? It wouldn't be difficult. The TV audience would lap it up, get big viewing figures, I reckon.
You need to get rid of the TV stations as well first. Clear them out.
Well, no, they're really useful things. You just need to change the ownership and the evil scheming and the subliminal messaging behind them. Other than that, they're great.
Yeah, yeah. They should do a great service. They don't, but they should.
Yeah, very occasionally they do, and an interesting program slips by. But 20 years ago, I threw my television away, and it really was one of the best things I ever did. However, I now have an internet addiction instead.
Exactly, exactly. I also don't have a TV, but or cable or any of those things. But the internet, oh my goodness, oh my goodness.
Everything is there. I just watched um, the official Navy film, an hour and a half or whatever it is, about Admiral Byrd's visit to Antarctica, and now I know exactly why he took an aircraft carrier and submarine and everything else. It wasn't to attack, as the conspiracy theories might say, something strange down in Antarctica, although there is a lot very strange in Antarctic. But the film's really fascinating to watch. It debunks a lot of the current stuff that's going about. But it is interesting that Admiral Byrd talks about this huge tract of land without snow in Antarctica.
Wow. Yeah, you see, I just keeping up with what's going on in South Africa
Yeah, that's
kind
enough.
of takes
Yeah,
up takes up most of my time. I just don't have. I just seem to not have enough hours in the day.
well, no, well, exactly. Let me just tell you before we finish, the most exciting thing that I know about, which is the new developments regarding GCMAF. And if anybody listening to this doesn't know what GCMAF is, there's a video called GCMAF, GCMAF, The Amazing Answer. And it's worth getting a start there. Since then, there are new products that are even better than GCMAF. But if anybody doesn't know about GCMAF, it is the most exciting health development in the world right now, with the exception of the big cover-ups like vitamin C. So, well, look, thank you so much, Karin, for all the fantastic information, and it's just incredible.
Clive, thank you very much. It is only with the help of people like you that we are getting the word out at all. So I am incredibly grateful to reach a new audience, new people that can hear the actual facts of what are going on. And they're welcome. In fact, I encourage them to Google it. Look on the net where everything is available. Have a look. See what is happening in South Africa. You will see that it is way worse than I could ever say on air because I will cry. And that doesn't help me at all. So I tell you as many of the facts as I can, but gruesome details don't help really, but you can find them for yourself.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, and
Thank you, Clive.
thank you to all our listeners.
Good night.